All right, we'll be starting Frankenstein, also subtitled The Modern Prometheus, written by Mary Shelley. The title of the book has a subset underneath it, From Paradise Lost by John Milton. Did I request thee, Maker, from my clay to mold me, man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? So the beginning of this book starts with an introduction written by Mary Shelley herself. The publishers of the Standard Novels, in selecting Frankenstein for one of their series, expressed a wish that I would furnish them with some account of the origin of the story. I am the more willing to comply because I shall thus give a general answer to the question so very frequently asked me, how I, then a young girl, came to think of and to dilate upon so very hideous an idea. It is very true that I am very averse to bringing myself forward in print, but as my account will only appear as an appendage to a former production, and as it will be confined to such topics as have connection to my authorship alone, I can scarcely accuse myself of a personal intrusion. It is not singular that, as the daughter of two persons of distinguished literary celebrity, I should very early in my life have thought of writing. As a child, I scribbled, and my favorite pastime during the hours given me for recreation was to write stories. Still, I had a dearer pleasure than this, which was the formation of castles in the air, the indulging in walking dreams, the following of trains of thought, which had for their subject the formation of a succession of imaginary incidents. My dreams were at once more fantastic and agreeable than my writings. In the latter, I was a close imitator, rather doing as others had done than putting down the suggestion of my own mind. What I wrote was intended at least for one other eye, my childhood's companion and friend. But my dreams were on my own. I accounted for them to nobody. They were my refuge when annoyed, my dearest pleasure when free. I lived principally in the country as a girl and passed a considerable time in Scotland. I made occasional visits to the blank and dreary northern shores of the Tay near Dundee. Blank and dreary on retrospection, I call them. They were not so to me then. They were the area of freedom and the pleasant region where unheeded I could commune with the creatures of my fancy. I wrote then that in a most commonplace style. It was beneath the trees of the grounds belonging to our house, or on the bleak sides of the woodless mountain near, that my true compositions, the airy flights of my imagination, were born and fostered. I did not make myself the heroine of the tales. Life appeared to me too commonplace an affair as regarding myself. I could not figure to myself that romantic woes or wonderful events would ever be my lot. But I was not confined to my own identity, and I could people the hours with my creations, far more interesting to me at that age than my own sensations. After this, my life became busier, and reality stood in place of fiction. My husband, however, was from the very first very anxious that I should prove myself worthy of my parentage and enroll myself in the page of fame. He was forever inciting me to obtain literary reputation, which, even on my own part, I cared for then, though since I have become infinitely indifferent to it. At this time, he desired that I should write, not so much with the idea that I could produce anything worthy of notice, but that he might himself judge how far I possessed the promise of better things hereafter. Still, I did nothing. Traveling and the cares of family occupied my time, and study in the way of reading or improving my ideas and communication with his far more cultivated mind was more of literary employment that engaged my attention. In the summer of 1816, we visited Switzerland and became the neighbors of Lord Byron. At first, we spent our pleasant hours on the lake or wandering on its shores, and Lord Byron, who was writing the third canto of Childe Harold, was the only one among us who put his thoughts down on paper. These, as he brought them successively to us, clothed in all the light and harmony of poetry, seemed to stamp as divine the glories of heaven and earth, whose influences we partook with him. But it proved a wet, ungenial summer, and incessant rain often confined us for days to the house. Some volumes of ghost stories translated from the German into French fell into our hands. There was the history of the inconstant lover who, when he thought to clasp the bride to whom he had pledged his vows, found himself in the arms of the pale ghost of her whom he had deserted. There was the tale of the sinful founder of his race, whose miserable doom it was to bestow the kiss of death on all the younger sons of his fated house, just when they reached the age of promise. His gigantic shadowy form, clothed like the ghosts of Hamlet, in complete armor but with the beaver up, was seen at midnight by the moon's fitful beams to advance slowly along the gloomy avenue. The shape was lost beneath the shadow of the castle walls, but soon a gate swung back, a step was heard, the door of the chamber opened, and he advanced to the couch of the blooming youth, cradled in healthy sleep. Eternal sorrow sat upon his face as he bent down and kissed the forehead of the boys, who, from that hour, withered like flowers snapped upon the stalk. I have not seen these stories since then, but their incidents are as fresh in my mind as if I had read them only yesterday. "We will each write a ghost story," said Lord Byron, and his proposition was acceded to. There were 4 of us. The noble author began a tale, a fragment of which he printed at the end of his poem Mazeppa. Shelley, more apt to embody ideas and sentiments in the radiance of brilliant imagery and in the music of the most melodious verse that adorns our language than to invent the machinery of a story, commenced one founded on the experiences of his early life. Poor Polidori had some terrible idea about a skull-headed lady who was so punished for peeping through a keyhole. What to see, I forget. Something very shocking and wrong, of course. But when he was reduced to a worse condition than the renowned Tom of Coventry, he did not know what to do with her and was obliged to dispatch her to the tomb of the Capulets, the only place for which she was fitted. The illustrious poets, also, annoyed by the platitude of prose, speedily relinquished their uncongenial task. I busied myself to think of a story to rival those which had excited us to the task, one which would speak to the mysterious fears of our nature and awaken thrilling horror, one to make the reader dread to look round, to curdle the blood and quicken the beatings of the heart. If I did not accomplish these things, my ghost story would be unworthy of its name. I thought and pondered vainly. I felt the blank incapability of invention, which is the greatest misery of authorship when dull. Nothing replies to our anxious invocations. "Have you thought of a story?" I was asked each morning, and each morning I was forced to reply with a mortifying negative. Everything must have a beginning, to speak in Sanchian phrase, and that beginning must be linked to something that went before. The Hindus give the world an elephant to support it, but they make the elephant stand upon a tortoise. Invention, it must be humbly admitted, does not consist in creating out of void, but out of chaos. The materials must in the first place be afforded. It can give form to dark, shapeless substances, but cannot bring into being the substance itself. In all matters of discovery and invention, even of those that appertain to the imagination, we are continually reminded of the story of Columbus and his egg. Invention consists in the capacity of seizing on the capabilities of a subject, and the power of molding and fashioning ideas to suggest it. Many and long were the conversations between Lord Byron and Shelley, to which I was a devout but nearly silent listener. During one of these, various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others, the nature of the principle of life, and whether there were any probability of its ever being discovered and communicated. They talked of the experiments of Dr. Darwin. I speak not of what the doctor really did or said that he did, but as more of my purpose of what was then spoken as having been done by him, who preserved a piece of vermicelli in a glass case till by some extraordinary means it began to move with voluntary motion. Not thus, after all, would life be given. Perhaps a corpse would be reanimated. Galvanism had given token of such things. Perhaps the component parts of a creature might be manufactured, brought together, and endued with vital warmth. Night waned upon this talk, and even the witching hour had gone by before we retired to rest. When I placed my head on my pillow, I did not sleep, nor could I be said to think. My imagination, unbidden, possessed and guided me, gifting the successive images that arose in my mind with a vividness far beyond the usual bonds of reverie. I saw with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be. For supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away from his odious handiwork horror-stricken. He would hope that, left to itself, the slight spark of life which he had communicated would fade, that this thing which had received such imperfect animation would subside into dead matter, and he might sleep in the belief that the silence of the grave would quench forever the transient existence of the hideous corpse which he had looked upon as the cradle of life. He sleeps, but he is awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at the bedside, opening his curtains and looking on him with yellow, watery, but speculative eyes. I opened mine in terror. The idea so possessed my mind that a thrill of fear ran through me, and I wished to exchange the ghastly image of my fancy for the realities around. I see them still, the very room, the dark parquet, the closed shutters with the moonlight struggling through, and the sense I had that the glassy lake and the white high Alps were beyond. I could not so easily get rid of my hideous phantom. Still it haunted me. I must try to think of something else. I recurred to my ghost story, my tiresome, unlucky ghost story. Oh, if I could only contrive one which would frighten my reader as I myself had been frightened that night. Swiftly as light and as cheering was the idea that broke in upon me. I have found it. What terrified me will terrify others, and I need only describe the specter which had haunted my midnight pillow. On the morrow, I announced that I had thought of a story. I began that day with the words, "It was on a dreary night of November," making only a transcript of the grim terrors of my waking dream. At first, I thought but a few pages or a short tale, but Shelley urged me to develop the idea at greater length. I certainly did not owe the suggestion of one incident, nor scarcely of one train of feeling to my husband, and yet, but for his incitement, it would never have taken the form in which it is presented to the world. From this declaration, I must now accept this preface. As far as I can recollect, it was entirely written by him. And now, once again, I bid my hideous progeny go forth and prosper. I have an affection for it was the offspring of happy days, when death and grief were but words which found no true echo in my heart. Its several pages speak of many a walk, many a drive, and many a conversation when I was not alone. And my companion was one who, in this world, I shall never see more. But this is for myself. My readers have nothing to do with these associations. I will add but one word as to the alterations I have made. They are principally those of style. I've changed no proportion of the story, nor introduced any new ideas or circumstances. I have mended the language where it was so bald as to interfere with the interests of the narrative, and these changes occur almost exclusively in the beginning of the first volume. Throughout, they are entirely confined to such parts as are mere adjuncts to the story, leaving the core and substance of it untouched. So Mary Shelley wrote that in 1831, and what did we say? She wrote the story of Frankenstein in 1816. So she wrote that introduction 15 years later. There's also a short preface that was written in 1817, so the first year the book was published. The event on which this fiction is founded has been supposed by Dr. Darwin and some of the physiological writers of Germany as not of impossible occurrence. I shall not be supposed as according the remotest degree of serious faith to such an imagination. Yet, in assuming it as the basis of a work of fancy, I have not considered myself as merely weaving a series of supernatural terrors. The event on which the interest of the story depends is exempt from the disadvantages of a mere tale of specters or enchantments. It was recommended by the novelty of the situations which it develops, and, however impossible as a physical trait, affords a point of view to the imagination for the delineating of human passions more comprehensive and commanding than any which the ordinary relations of existing events can yield. I have thus endeavored to preserve the truth of the elementary principles of human nature, while I have not scrupled to innovate upon their combinations. The Iliad, the tragic poetry of Greece, Shakespeare in The Tempest and Midsummer Night's Dream, and most especially Milton in Paradise Lost, conform to this rule. And the most humble novelist who seeks to confer or receive amusement from his labors may, without presumption, apply to prose fiction a license, or rather a rule, from the adoption of which so many exquisite combinations of human feeling have resulted in the highest specimens of poetry. The circumstance on which my story rests was suggested in casual conversation. It was commenced partly as a source of amusement and partly as an expedient for exercising any untried resources of mind. Other motives were mingled with these as the work proceeded. I am by no means indifferent to the manner in which whatever moral tendencies exist in the sentiments or characters it contains shall affect the reader. Yet my chief concern is that this respect has been limited to the avoiding the unnerving effects of the novels of the present day, and to the exhibition of the amiableness of domestic affectation and the excellence of universal virtue. That's a romantic concept. The opinions which naturally spring from the character and situation of the hero are by no means to be conceived as existing always in my own conviction, nor is my inference justly to be drawn from the following pages as prejudicing any philosophical doctrine of whatever kind. It is a subject also of additional interest to the author that this story was begun in the majestic region where the scene is principally laid, and in society which cannot cease to be regretted. I passed the summer of 1816 in the environs of Geneva. The season was cold and rainy, and in the evenings we crowded around a blazing wood fire and occasionally amused ourselves with some German stories of ghosts which happened to fall into our hands. These tales excited us in a playful desire of imitation. Two other friends, a tale from the pen of whom one would be far more acceptable to the public than anything I can ever hope to produce, and myself agreed to write each a story founded on some supernatural occurrence. The weather, however, suddenly became serene, and my two friends left me on a journey among the Alps, and lost in their magnificent scenes which they present all memory of their ghostly visions. The following tale is the only one which has been completed. I do want to share something else. This is from the foreword of this novel. And this writer, Walter James Miller, provides some great insight and analysis as we get into Frankenstein. Kind of sets the stage. Like Joseph Heller's Catch-22, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's Frankenstein did give us a name to help identify one of the modern problems. But giving us a much-needed symbol to keep us conscious of the threat of science run amok is just one of the many accomplishments of the 19-year-old Mary Shelley. She had intended in 1816 simply to write a thrilling horror story, but she underestimated herself. Because of her family background, the books she devoured and had heard discussed, the people she had talked with, and her own genius in sensing the spirit of modern times, she produced something greater than just a horror story. She produced a major novel of ideas. Here's a short list of some of the other cultural achievements of the greatest horror story ever written. She dramatized, on a stage stretching from snow-peaked Switzerland to the polar ice fields, major questions posed by philosophers like William Godwin, that was her dad, John Locke, Voltaire, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And in her implicit rebuttal of the claims of scientists like Francis Bacon and Humphrey Davy, she accurately identified, rather early in studies of the history of ideas, what feminist critics now call masculinist science. She cast a new and sickening light on some of the most sacred aspects of the patriarchal system, from its deepest unacknowledged animosities toward females to its glorification of its dangerous work ethic and of hierarchy. She insisted on recognizing and coming to terms with the role of the irrational in human affairs. This, mind you, long after Shakespeare's emphasis on it had been downgraded by the Age of Reason, and long before Freud, Jung, and Lacan would upgrade it again in modern times. She not only pioneered what we now, since 1926, call science fiction, she supplied it with one of its perennial themes, right down to Michael Crichton's Jurassic Park and last night's science fiction on TV. And the Frankenstein myth she launched was proliferated into dozens of sequels of films, such as the James Whale Boris Karloff classic, and in fiction, The Memoirs of Elizabeth Frankenstein by Theodore Roszak, another writer who gave us a much-needed new word, counterculture. The cloud of mind is discharging its collected lightning. So Mary Shelley's husband Percy wrote about the growth of democratic sentiment in England. He could just as easily have been describing what happened to Mary one evening in 1816 when all her lifelong sentiments, anxieties, and principles suddenly converged into one lightning bolt of inspiration. In that sense, her novel Frankenstein actually began to collect when her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, brilliant author of Vindication of the Rights of Women, gave birth to our Mary in August 1797 and died 11 days later. Daughter Mary would brood all her life on the plight of a person brought up without a real mother. Notice how many characters in Frankenstein struggle with the problem of being an orphan or of the broken family. Her father, William Godwin, equally famous author of Inquiry into the Principles of Political Justice, gave up trying to be mother and father to Mary and her half-sister gave up trying to be mother and father to Mary and her half-sister and married a widow who clearly favored her own two children. Mary had plenty of opportunities to reflect on family influence and responsibilities, a major theme in Frankenstein. Although deficient in family feeling, Godwin did help young Mary in several literary ways. The Godwin Juvenile Library, which he founded with his new wife, published Mary's clever 156-line satirical ballad, Monsieur Nong Tong Paw, written when she was only 11. He trained his daughter in the stimulating practice of reading several books concurrently, and he allowed her to sit in on social evenings he'd staged for other literary giants like William Wordsworth, Charles Lamb, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. One awesome evening, she actually heard Coleridge read aloud his Ancient Mariner. Her impressions of the sailor supernaturally punished for his violation of nature would clearly influence her conception of her scientist Frankenstein. Usually deprived of her father's intimate company, he often sent her on long visits to Scotland. She nevertheless interacted with his ideas and her mother's through her passionate readings of their respective treatises and novels. Godwin believed, like Voltaire, in the power of pure reason to solve all social, political, and personal problems. And like Rousseau, Godwin felt that humans are by nature benevolent and become evil only when abused by society. Government, he preached, and other institutions like marriage and the family impose evil restraints on citizens and must be abolished. But he opposed violence as a means of changing things. Instead, he saw well-educated citizens working toward a better world by repressing emotions and reasoning person to person. And so he became the father of philosophical anarchism. His ideas of progress, of the perfectibility of humanity, of perpetual peace through arbitration, inspired writers such as William Wordsworth and Percy Shelley. Godwin's all-out critique of the establishment lies behind several stinging passages in Frankenstein, as when the monster learns about European life. Quote, "The strange system of society was explained to me. I heard of the division of property, of immense wealth and squalid poverty, of rank descent and noble blood. A man might be doomed to waste his powers for the profits of the chosen few." Mary's mother, in writings published mainly before her marriage to Godwin, defended the French Revolution with an implicit threat that it could spread to England where, she said, the miseries, an important word in Frankenstein, of the poor were radicalizing the workers. She attacked the hierarchical system that required underpaid mechanics to support the rich and idle aristocracy and deprived women of any chance to realize their human potential. She demanded equal political rights for all English persons deprived of the vote, which meant at that time most members of the middle class, all workers, and all women regardless of class. To those familiar with Wollstonecraft's Vindication, says the critic James P. Davies, Shelley's debt of her mother for ideas and even for phrasing will be self-evident. When beautiful, brilliant Mary returned from Scotland in 1814, she found the handsome visionary poet Shelley a frequent visitor at her father's house. Just 22, Percy had already published 2 horror stories, several inflammatory pamphlets, one had gotten him expelled from Oxford, and Queen Mab, a long work in 9 verse cantos and 17 prose notes. The verse attacks the English monarchy, war, and established religion. The prose advocates free love and atheism. Having thus ransacked the ideas of Godwin and Wollstonecraft, Shelley now took their daughter as well. At her mother's grave, Mary confessed that she returned Percy's love. Although he was married and a father, they eloped to Europe. Okay, did you catch all of that? So Percy Bysshe Shelley, who has been a frequent visitor in the Godwin household, takes Mary to her mother's grave to propose to her, even though he's already married, and they elope. They collaborated on a work later to be published as The History of a 6 Weeks Tour. After his first wife died, Mary became Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. They lost their first child, Clara, in 1815, but the following year was their Annus Mirabilis. They now had a son, William, a name to figure tremendously for Mary and Frankenstein. And that year, Percy's poems included two that would loom important in her thinking about Frankenstein: Mont Blanc, which helped her and with her settings, and Alastor, a long poem about a young man who, obsessed with seeking ideal truth, unwittingly loses all the benefits of human companionship. Alastor dramatizes what would become one of the tragedies of Mary's ill-fated scientist. In their new home in Switzerland, Percy and Mary read voluminously, including John Locke's essay on human understanding, which guided her and her mother's psychological development, and Humphrey Davy's books on chemistry. As Anne Miller, one of the leading interpreters of Shelley, points out, Professor Waldman's speeches on Frankenstein are drawn largely from Davy. Percy became an enthusiastic supporter of Davy's program for scientific progress, but Mary made her reservations clear in her novel. A typical disquieting note is Davy's passage in which he praises modern masters who penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. Here Davy is following in the tradition of Francis Bacon, who called on natural philosophers to put nature on the rack and torture her secrets out of her. This recurrent image of male scientists violating female nature surely figured, at least subliminally, in Mary's stunning insight into Frankenstein's character. He would be a man deeply conflicted between love and misogyny. The cloud of mind was darkening. On nights famous in literary history, the Shelleys visited their neighbors on Lake Geneva, Lord Byron, and his physician, Dr. John Polidori. Some nights, Percy and Byron discussed the principle of life, a topic in vogue because of sensational experiments with reanimating dead bodies. Galvani, for example, had made dead frogs jerk as though alive by sending electricity through their legs. Hanged men taken down from the gallows had also been made to thrash about. Mary herself suffered from recurrent dreams that she had massaged her dead baby, Clara, until she was brought back to life. Then on the night of June 15, 1816, they all read ghost stories aloud, and Byron proposed that they should each write one. The way that Mary struggled with ideas for what could have been a simple tale shows that she felt she needed a chance to bring all her experience together into one great symbolic synthesis. Her anguish as the neglected child of a genius, as the mother of an unreanimated dead daughter, and of the infant William for whose life she correctly feared. Her wealth of still unintegrated ideas, some attractive to her, some repugnant, gleaned from the works of her parents, her husband, and other writers. Her dread of her father's impersonal rationalism, and her husband's unconditional love of science. All this was suddenly concentrated and discharged into one bolt of collective lightning. One of those evenings in a deep reverie, she actually envisioned the horrible scene that, in our 1831 edition, opens chapter 5. Working backward and forward from that germinal fantasy, she finished her book in 11 months. Perhaps she was too exhausted to write a preface, so Percy wrote it for her. As James Reiger and Miller have made clear to us with cogent evidence, Percy also edited her text, changing some of Mary's simple prose to more elaborate and often stilted literary English. Where she wrote, "We were all equal," he rewrote, "Neither of us possessed the slightest preeminence over the other," but in his editing had obviously assumed preeminence. The first edition was published anonymously in 1818 and was widely assumed to be Percy's work. Godwin put out a second edition in 1824 to take advantage of a stage version that was running in London. But the third edition, issued 9 years after Percy's death, contains Mary's own byline on the title page and her own author's introduction and her own final revisions. That's the text that we'll be reading. A couple more notes here from this introduction. After Frankenstein appeared, Mary's life was a mixture of new tragedy and muted triumph. Her second daughter, Clara Evelina, and her son, William, were dead by 1819, the same year that Percy Florence was born. Mary's fifth pregnancy miscarried in 1822. She was saved from bleeding to death by her science-minded husband. He set her down in an ice bath until the doctor arrived. 3 weeks later, he was heading home in his skiff Ariel, sailing off the coast of Viareggio, and As Mary tells us in her brilliant and sensitive notes of his poems, he was wrapped from sight by a thunderstorm. And when the cloud of the tempest passed away, no sign remained of where he had been. 10 days later, his body washed ashore and cremated. Okay, they burned his body on a funeral pyre on the beach after it washed up. And I've read a legend that supposedly when his body burned away, his heart had been calcified by the salt water, and Mary Shelley took his heart off of the funeral pyre and kept it in her writing desk for the rest of her life. Is that true? Who knows? But for the author of Frankenstein to have her late husband's calcified heart in her writing desk, I don't care if it's true or not. Widow Mary returned to London to groom her sole surviving child to inherit the baronetcy of his grandfather, Sir Timothy Shelley. Meanwhile, she supported self and son by producing a steady stream of short tales, encyclopedia articles, and novels, along the way turning out landmark editions of Percy Shelley's work. She resigned herself to the fact that Percy Florence, son and grandson of great talents, had no ambition beyond being called Sir Percy. Exhausted and paralyzed by strokes, she died in 1851 at age 53. With symbolism rarely so well achieved in cemeteries, she is buried in Bournemouth between Mother Wollstonecraft and Father Godwin. Most of her major works are always in print now. She is the subject of hundreds of critical studies, and her Frankenstein lives on as a great cautionary tale and a major novel of ideas. I have nothing more to add because that was a brilliant introduction. I will be back in the next day or two and we'll get started with the opening letters and into chapter 1 of this brilliant novel. The only thing I will add is if you are not aware, Frankenstein is the doctor. The creature is not named Frankenstein. And we do not call him the monster. We call him the creature.